I didn't find out about my brother's wedding from him. I didn't get a call. I didn't get a message. I wasn't even given the chance to pretend it didn't hurt. I found out by accident through a smiling photo, white flowers, and a caption that said, "Best day of our lives." Everyone was there. Cousins, old friends, people who barely knew him. Except me. I kept rereading the date, convinced I had misunderstood something obvious. I checked my phone. No missed calls. No explanations waiting quietly in my inbox. Just silence. Intentional, careful silence. All night I asked myself the same question: what did I do wrong? But the truth wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal. And it wasn't about love. The real reason I wasn't invited didn't come out at the wedding. It came out the next day when a stranger called my phone, spoke my full legal name, and asked if I was sitting down. That was the moment I realized the wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a decision. And someone had worked very hard to make sure I wasn't there. Before we continue, if you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, tell me your location and local time in the comments. And if stories about quiet strength and delayed justice resonate with you, consider subscribing. You're not alone here. Growing up, my family never announced that my brother mattered more than I did. There was no speech, no cruel sentence spoken out loud. Instead, it lived in patterns, quiet, repetitive moments that taught you your place without ever naming it. My brother Daniel was 2 years older than me. In our Ohio suburb, he was the kind of kid adults remembered. He was loud enough to be charming, confident enough to be forgiven. When he ran through the house, knocking things over, my parents laughed and called him energetic. When I stayed in my room reading, they called me Easy. Easy became my role. At dinner, Daniel talked about his day in long, animated stories. My parents leaned in, asked follow-up questions, laughed at the right moments. When I spoke, it was usually to answer something directly: how school was, how a test went. The conversation moved on quickly after that. No one was being unkind. They just didn't linger on me. I learned early that attention wasn't evenly distributed. You earned it by taking up space. And I learned just as early that taking up space came with consequences. When Daniel struggled in middle school, my parents worried. They met with teachers. They adjusted schedules. When I struggled quietly with anxiety before exams, I told myself it was my responsibility to manage it. I never thought to ask for help. No one had taught me that help was something I could claim. The difference became sharper when money entered the picture. Daniel got into a private college 3 states away. It was expensive, more than my parents had planned for, but they found a way. They refinanced the house. They talked about his future like it was a shared project. "It'll pay off," my father said more than once. When my acceptance letter came, it was from a solid public university with a partial scholarship. I remember standing in the kitchen holding the envelope, waiting for excitement to spread through the room. My mother hugged me and said she was proud of how self-sufficient I was. Self-sufficient sounded like praise. It took me years to realize it was also permission for everyone else to step back. I took out student loans without complaint. I worked part-time. I learned how to stretch grocery money and how to say no to myself before anyone else had to. Daniel called home to complain about workload and dorm food. I called home to reassure my parents that I was fine. And I was at least on the surface. After college, our lives continued along the same invisible tracks. Daniel stayed close to home. Through one of my father's connections, he landed a job at a mid-sized company. His salary climbed quickly. Promotions came with speeches and dinners and congratulations. My parents attended his milestones like they were family holidays. I moved farther away, first for graduate school, then for work. I chose a career that didn't sparkle but felt steady. The pay wasn't impressive, but the responsibility was real. I learned how to manage projects, how to be dependable, how to keep my emotions contained in professional settings. Containment came easily to me. I had practiced my whole life. When my parents talked about us to others, they always said they were proud of both their children. But there was a difference in tone. With Daniel, it was pride edged with excitement. With me, it was relief. "She's doing well," my mother would say. "She doesn't need much." I heard that sentence so many times it became part of my identity. I didn't need much. I didn't ask for much. I didn't expect much. Daniel and I weren't close, but we weren't estranged either. We existed in a polite middle ground. Birthday texts, holiday check-ins, occasional calls that never went very deep. At family gatherings, we sat across from each other and talked about safe topics, traffic, work schedules, how fast time was moving. There were no fights, no confrontations, no dramatic fallout that could explain distance. and because there was no visible conflict, I assumed the bond was still there, intact beneath the surface. When Daniel started dating Claire, I heard about her through my parents first. She had a good job, a strong personality, and a family that valued appearances. The first time I met her was at Christmas 2 years before the wedding. She shook my hand firmly, looked me in the eye, and smiled in a way that felt practiced. She asked me about my work. She listened carefully to my answers. Too carefully, like she was filing something away. I didn't think much of it at the time. After that, news about the engagement came secondhand. A ring, a proposal story, photos shared in the family group chat. Everyone reacted with enthusiasm. I added my congratulations, my heart emojis, my polite excitement. Then came the planning. Venues, dates, guest lists discussed vaguely over the phone when my mother called. I heard phrases like small ceremony and tight numbers. No one ever asked me about my schedule. No one checked my availability. At first, I assumed they would. I was Daniel's sister. Of course I would be there. It didn't even occur to me that attendance was something I needed to confirm. Months passed. The details stayed fuzzy. I told myself not to be sensitive, not to read into silence. I had learned that lesson before. Every time I questioned my place in the family, I ended up feeling embarrassed for wanting reassurance. So I stayed quiet. The night I realized something was truly off was unremarkable. I was alone in my apartment, washing dishes after dinner when my mother called. She talked about weather, about a neighbor's surgery, about nothing urgent. Then casually she mentioned that the wedding was almost here. I waited. She didn't say the date. She didn't ask if I had booked a flight. She didn't ask if I was excited. When we hung up, I stood there with my hands resting on the counter, water still running, listening to the steady noise fill the room. A familiar feeling settled into my chest, the one that came when something important was happening without me. Still, I didn't call Daniel. I didn't confront my parents. I didn't demand clarity. Silence had always been my shield. It kept me from being labeled difficult. It kept family peace intact. It kept me safe. What I didn't realize then was that this time my silence wasn't just convenient. It was necessary. Because whatever was coming next depended on me not being there. Distance crept into my relationship with Daniel so quietly that for a long time I convinced myself it wasn't really distance at all. It felt more like space, neutral, harmless, something adults naturally developed as their lives filled up. I lived nearly 600 miles away by then, in a city where no one knew my family name or my history. My days were structured, predictable. I worked long hours, came home to a small apartment, cooked simple meals, and went to bed early more often than not. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was honest. Every bill I paid, every promotion I earned, I had done on my own. Daniel's life looked different from the outside. He stayed close to our parents, close to the networks that had always protected him. He moved into a larger house, one my parents proudly referred to as a smart investment. When I visited home, they took me to see it like it was a landmark. "He's really doing well," my father would say, gesturing around the living room. I agreed. There was nothing else to say. Our conversations became brief and functional. If I called, it was usually because our mother had asked me to check in on him. If he called, it was often because he needed something: advice on paperwork, help proofreading, an email, reassurance that a decision made sense. I gave those things freely. It felt easier than questioning why I was always the one providing support from the background. When I suggested visiting, Daniel would say things like, "Yeah, we should plan something," without ever naming a date. When I did visit for holidays, everything felt carefully polite. No tension. No warmth either. Just a surface-level calm that made it hard to point to anything wrong. That was the most confusing part. There was no clear moment when I could say, "This is when things changed." It was more like realizing one day that you were no longer included in certain conversations. Decisions had already been made by the time you heard about them. And everyone seemed surprised that you might feel left out. As the wedding approached, I noticed this pattern intensifying. Plans were discussed in fragments. My parents mentioned tastings, fittings, meetings with vendors. They spoke about them the way you talk about weather, background noise, not something that required my input. Once during a phone call, I asked casually, "So what weekend is it again?" There was a pause. A brief one, but noticeable. "Oh, we'll send you the details," my mother said quickly, then changed the subject. I told myself I was imagining things. I didn't want to be the person who made everything awkward by asking too many questions. I had learned over years that clarity often came with consequences. If you pushed too hard, you risked being labeled dramatic, insecure, or selfish. So I waited. Waiting had always been my strength. I watched from a distance as photos appeared online. Engagement parties I hadn't known about. A bridal shower my mother attended without mentioning to me. Each image landed softly, like a small weight added to my chest. Not crushing, just heavy enough to notice. I still assumed I would be at the wedding. I never considered that I wouldn't be. Who excludes a sibling without a reason? And if there was a reason, surely someone would explain it. But explanations never came. Weeks before the wedding, my work schedule finally lightened enough that I could have traveled. I even looked up flights once late at night, telling myself I was just being proactive. I stopped when I realized I didn't know the exact date, the venue, or whether my presence was expected. That realization should have prompted a call. A confrontation. Something. Instead, I closed my laptop. There was a deep-seated fear behind my silence, one I rarely admitted even to myself. I was afraid that if I asked directly, I would confirm what I already suspected, that I wasn't as essential as I had assumed, that my role in the family had always been conditional, so I did nothing. The wedding day arrived quietly. I knew because my phone felt heavier that morning, as if it were waiting to deliver news it had already decided not to give me. I went to work, I attended meetings, I smiled at coworkers. No one there knew what the day represented. During lunch, curiosity got the better of me. I opened social media. There it was, Daniel in a tailored suit, Claire in white, a caption about forever, comments flooding in with congratulations. I scrolled slowly, my thumb moving without urgency. I wasn't searching for myself in the pictures. I already knew I wouldn't be there. What surprised me was how calm I felt. Not numb, just steady. Like something I had been bracing for had finally arrived. That evening, my family group chat stayed silent. No photos, no messages, no attempt to soften the exclusion. It was as if acknowledging my absence would require an explanation no one was prepared to give. I didn't post anything. I didn't reach out. I didn't let my hurt spill into public spaces. Silence once again felt safer. That night I lay awake longer than usual. Memories surfaced, small moments from childhood, when I had stepped back so someone else could step forward. Times I had chosen not to speak because peace felt more valuable than being heard. I wondered briefly if I had trained my family to see me this way. If my willingness to disappear had become something they relied on. The thought was uncomfortable, but it didn't make me angry. It made me tired. The next morning I expected the feeling to fade, for the ache to dull into something manageable. Instead, my phone rang mid-morning, the number unfamiliar, the area code not one I recognized. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something told me not to. When I answered, a calm professional voice asked for me by my full legal name. Not the nickname my family used. Not the shortened version friends preferred. My full name. Yes, I said slowly. This is she. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of papers shifting. I'm calling regarding a matter connected to your family, the voice said. It's important. And it concerns something that happened yesterday. In that moment, standing alone in my apartment, I finally understood something I had been missing. The distance, the silence, the exclusion. None of it had been accidental. And whatever the reason was, it had never been about love. For a second, I couldn't speak. The voice on the phone was steady, neutral, the kind of voice that belonged to someone used to delivering information without emotion. It didn't sound like bad news or good news. It sounded official. I'm listening, I finally said. The woman introduced herself as an associate from a law office in Columbus. She didn't explain why she was calling right away. Instead, she asked me to confirm my date of birth and current address. I hesitated, then answered. There was no reason not to. Still, something about the formality made my stomach tighten. Thank you, she said. I need to ask, are you aware of any legal documents connected to your parents' estate? The question landed heavier than I expected. My parents are alive, I replied carefully. And as far as I know, no. That's fine, she said. This isn't about probate. It's about a trust amendment executed several years ago. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my free hand gripping the edge. A trust. My parents had never mentioned one to me. They spoke openly about Daniel's future, about helping him build wealth, about securing things for the family. But nothing had ever been framed as something that included me in a formal way. The associate continued explaining that certain documents required confirmation from all named parties following a triggering event. The triggering event, she clarified, had occurred the day before. The wedding, I asked before I could stop myself. Yes, she said without hesitation. Your brother's marriage activated a clause that required review. I closed my eyes. The pieces began to align in a way that made my chest feel hollow. This wasn't about feelings. This wasn't about family tension or misunderstandings. This was about timing, about legality, about making sure certain conditions were met or avoided. Why am I being contacted now? I asked. There was another pause, longer this time, because she said carefully, your absence raised a question. She didn't accuse. She didn't imply. She simply stated a fact. Apparently, the trust included language about informed consent and acknowledgement from all beneficiaries when significant family events occurred, especially those involving marital status. The associate explained that the intent was to prevent unilateral decisions that could affect asset distribution without transparency. I was listed as a beneficiary. The word felt strange in my ears. Beneficiary. It implied intention, inclusion, something I had never associated with my place in the family. I don't understand, I said honestly. I wasn't told about any of this. That's clear, she replied. And that's part of the issue. She asked if I had been invited to the wedding. I answered truthfully. No, I had not received an invitation. No date, no details, nothing. She noted it without comment. Before ending the call, she informed me that a formal review meeting had been scheduled for later that week. Representatives from the firm, my parents, and my brother would be present. My attendance, she said, was strongly recommended. After the call ended, I stood in my kitchen for a long time. The room felt unchanged, same light, same quiet hum, but something inside me had shifted. I hadn't been excluded by accident. I had been removed. And suddenly the silence made sense. That afternoon, messages started coming in. Not explanations, not apologies, just fragments. My mother texted first. Did you get a call today? I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering. For once, I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't say everything was fine. Yes, I typed back. Nothing more. Minutes later, Daniel called. I let it ring. When I finally answered, his voice sounded tight, controlled. Hey, he said. I heard you talk to someone. Someone from a law office, I replied evenly. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. Look, he began, I didn't want things to get complicated. I waited. Silence had taught me patience. It wasn't personal, he continued. There were reasons. Legal reasons, I asked. He didn't answer right away. We were trying to keep things simple, he said instead. Simple. The word almost made me laugh. By not telling me, I asked quietly. Another pause. Longer than the last. You don't understand the bigger picture, Daniel said. This was about protecting everyone. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I had learned that defensiveness only made people dig in deeper. Then explain it, I said. He didn't. The call ended awkwardly unfinished. No clarity, no acknowledgement of hurt, just a vague sense that something had slipped out of his control. Over the next 2 days, I received more messages. My parents asked if I was upset. Claire sent a brief text saying she hoped I was doing okay and that things had been stressful. No one explained why I had been deliberately kept out of an event that changed our family's legal landscape. I started to understand the shape of it. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't been informed, if everything appeared unanimous, the process would have gone smoothly. No questions, no delays, no oversight. My presence complicated things. For the first time in my life, I saw my silence not as a virtue, but as a vulnerability others had learned to exploit. The review meeting was scheduled for Friday morning, held at the law office downtown. I booked a flight without telling anyone. I didn't ask if I was welcome. I had already learned the answer to that question. As the plane lifted off, I looked out the window and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not anger, not fear, clarity. Whatever had been arranged behind my back was now exposed. Not because I demanded it be, but because facts don't bend to convenience. And for once, I didn't have to raise my voice. I just had to show up. The wedding was already over by the time I boarded the plane, but its shadow followed me through the airport like something unfinished. Everywhere I looked, people were moving with purpose, families hugging at gates, couples holding hands, children tugging at tired parents, ordinary scenes, normal lives. And yet I felt like I was traveling toward a version of my family I had never truly seen. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. Not my parents, not Daniel, not Claire. There was something important about that decision. For once, I wasn't arriving to keep the peace or smooth things over. I wasn't coming as the accommodating daughter or the understanding sister. I was coming because I had been summoned by documents, by timelines, by a truth that didn't care how uncomfortable it made people. The law office was in a tall, glass-fronted building downtown. Clean lines, neutral colors. The kind of place where emotions were kept out of sight, replaced by procedures and paper trails. I arrived early as I always did and sat in the waiting area with my hands folded neatly in my lap. My name was called exactly on time. Inside the conference room, everything was arranged with precision. Folders stacked evenly, name placards placed carefully. A carafe of water at the center of the table. Two attorneys I didn't know stood when I entered and introduced themselves. Their tone was courteous, professional, detached. Then the door opened again. My parents walked in together. My mother's eyes widened when she saw me, a flicker of something, shock, maybe guilt crossing her face before she smoothed it away. My father nodded stiffly, his jaw set. Daniel came in last. He avoided my eyes. No one hugged me. No one asked how my flight was. The absence of those gestures felt intentional, like everyone had silently agreed to keep this moment strictly business. The meeting began without ceremony. One of the attorneys explained the purpose of the review. Years earlier, my parents had established a family trust. At the time, the intention as recorded was to ensure fairness between siblings, while allowing flexibility for life events, marriage, property, acquisition, business ventures. A clause was highlighted on the screen at the front of the room. Any marriage involving a direct beneficiary required disclosure and acknowledgement from all named parties, prior to execution, to prevent conflicts of interest or undisclosed asset shifts. The words were clinical, precise, unemotional, but the implications were anything but. Daniel shifted in his seat. My mother's hands tightened around her purse. The attorney continued. The trust had been amended 2 years earlier, shortly after Daniel became engaged. The amendment adjusted future distributions contingent on marital status and spousal involvement. It was legal, properly filed, signed. But there was a problem. There is no record, the attorney said calmly, that the second beneficiary was informed prior to the triggering event. He looked at me. That was when I understood the full shape of what had happened. If I had attended the wedding, if I had been informed, acknowledged, present, everything would have proceeded without question. My awareness would have implied consent. Silence would have been agreement. By excluding me, they had tried to delay that reckoning, to move forward without scrutiny. But the absence itself had triggered review. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the projector. This was not meant to exclude anyone, my father said suddenly, his voice tight. We were just trying to avoid unnecessary stress. On whom one of the attorneys asked politely. No one answered. Daniel finally spoke. We didn't think it was a big deal, he said, not looking at me. She lives far away. It was a small wedding. Small. Nearly 200 guests, according to the photos. The attorney nodded, unreactive. Intent is not the issue here, he said. Compliance is. Folders were opened. Pages turned. Numbers appeared on the screen, asset valuations, projected distributions, timelines measured in years and dollars. The figures were substantial enough to make the air feel heavier. I listened without interrupting. This wasn't the first time I had been talked around. But it was the first time my silence wasn't mistaken for ignorance. The conclusion was clear. Because proper disclosure hadn't occurred, certain aspects of the trust amendment were temporarily suspended pending acknowledgement and review. Nothing catastrophic, nothing dramatic, just a pause, a delay, an insistence on transparency. Daniel's face tightened. My mother looked down at her hands. No one asked how I felt. No one apologized. And somehow, that hurt less than it would have before. The meeting ended as formally as it had begun. Instructions were given. Follow-ups scheduled. Everyone stood. As my parents gathered their things, my mother finally turned to me. We didn't think you'd come, she said quietly. I didn't know I was invited, I replied. The words landed between us, simple and undeniable. Daniel lingered behind as the others left. For a moment, it was just the two of us in the room where everything had shifted. You didn't have to do this, he said. I didn't, I agreed. You did. He looked at me, then really looked like he was seeing me for the first time, without the assumptions he'd carried his whole life. I didn't wait for a response. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed. People hurried along sidewalks, unaware that anything significant had happened inside that building. But for me, something fundamental had changed. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't demanded fairness. I had simply existed in a space where my presence mattered. And that, I realized as I walked away, was enough to stop everything they had tried to rush through without me. I thought the meeting would be the end of it. A pause, a complication, an uncomfortable reminder that I existed in places my family preferred I didn't. I expected a quiet aftermath, private resentment, careful distance, maybe a few strained phone calls that would eventually fade into polite silence. I underestimated how fragile, carefully constructed plans become once they're exposed to daylight. The first sign came the next morning. I was back at my hotel, sitting at the small desk near the window, answering work emails as if my life hadn't just split into a before and after. Around 9:30 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "We need to talk. Today." No greeting, no softening words. I didn't respond right away. I finished the email I was writing, reread it, then hit send. Control had always been my quiet rebellion, doing one thing at a time, refusing to let urgency dictate my emotions. When I finally replied, I kept it brief. "I'm available this afternoon." The call came less than an hour later. My mother's voice sounded tired, not angry, not apologetic, just worn down in a way I hadn't heard before. "Your father is very upset," she said. "This has created a lot of stress." I almost asked who the stress was for. Instead, I waited. "We didn't mean to hurt you," she continued. "We just didn't think it was necessary to involve you in all of this." Involving me, I said carefully, would have meant telling me the truth. Silence. She exhaled slowly. "You've always been so independent," she said. "We assumed you wouldn't want to be dragged into legal matters." I closed my eyes. There it was again, the old justification. Independence as excuse. Capability as exclusion. "I wasn't given a choice," I replied. That was the part she struggled with. I could hear it in her breathing, in the way she hesitated before speaking again. "Daniel is worried," she said finally. "This delay could affect a lot of things." "Like what I asked?" She didn't answer directly. She spoke instead about timelines, about commitments already made, about how complicated everything had become. I listened, noting what she didn't say as much as what she did. She never said it was wrong to exclude me. She only said it was inconvenient that it hadn't worked. By the time the call ended, I felt oddly calm. The guilt I had carried for years about being distant, about not being closer, about not needing them, had begun to loosen its grip. For the first time, I could see how my role had been shaped not just by my own choices, but by everyone else's comfort. That afternoon, Daniel called again. I answered. "This is spiraling," he said without preamble. "The lawyers are asking questions they didn't need to ask." "They're doing their job," I replied. "You could help stop this," he said. "All you have to do is acknowledge the amendment and move on." There it was, the real request. Not an apology, not accountability, compliance. "I can't acknowledge something I was intentionally kept from," I said. "You're being difficult," he snapped. I let the word hang between us. "I've been quiet my entire life," I said evenly. "This isn't difficulty. This is accuracy." He went quiet. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled. "You don't understand what's at stake," he said. "This affects my marriage, my future." "And mine," I replied. Another pause. He ended the call without saying goodbye. Over the next few days, information came to me in pieces. Not from my family, never directly, but through formal channels. Emails from the law office, requests for clarification, notices of scheduled follow-ups. I learned that the trust held assets I hadn't known about. Commercial property, investment accounts, figures that made my stomach tighten not because of greed, but because of how casually they had been managed without transparency. The review wasn't about taking anything away from Daniel. That much was clear. It was about restoring balance, ensuring that no one party could make decisions that shifted long-term outcomes without accountability. In other words, it was about fairness, something my family had always spoken about in theory but rarely practiced. The second meeting was scheduled for the following week. This one would include a senior partner from the firm, someone with the authority to make determinations if compliance wasn't achieved voluntarily. When I arrived, the atmosphere was different, less rushed, more serious. The senior partner, a woman with silver-streaked hair and an unyielding calm, listened as events were summarized. She asked questions that cut through explanations and landed on facts. Dates, signatures, Omissions. She asked Daniel directly why I hadn't been informed. He hesitated. Then said, "We didn't think it was necessary." She nodded once. "Necessity isn't subjective when obligations are written," she said. No raised voice. No judgment. Just truth. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the trust amendment would remain under suspension until full disclosure and acknowledgement were completed properly. Not retroactively. Not casually. Properly. Outside the building, my parents approached me. My father looked older than I remembered. Smaller. "We did what we thought was best," he said. "I know," I replied, "but best for whom?" He didn't answer. That night alone again, I thought about all the moments I had chosen silence to protect others. All the times I had stepped back to keep peace. I had believed that endurance was the same as strength. Now I understood the difference. Strength wasn't loud. It wasn't confrontational. Sometimes it was simply refusing to disappear when others found it convenient. And the most unsettling part for them, at least, was that I wasn't asking for anything. I was just standing where I had always belonged. By the time the third meeting was scheduled, I had stopped feeling like an intruder in rooms I was never meant to enter. The anxiety that had followed me through the first two meetings had softened into something steadier, an awareness that whatever was happening now was no longer about emotion. It was about records, about paper trails, about choices that had been made long before anyone put on a wedding ring. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning, in the same glass-fronted building downtown. This time I arrived without hesitation. I knew where to park. I knew which floor to go to. I even recognized the receptionist who greeted me with a polite nod that suggested I was no longer a surprise. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere felt heavier, not tense, resolved. The kind of quiet that settles when people realize outcomes are approaching, and not all of them will be favorable. The senior partner was there again. So was a financial analyst I hadn't met before, seated with a laptop, open charts already prepared. My parents sat side by side, closer than usual, like people bracing against something they couldn't move. Daniel and Claire arrived together. Claire's hand rested on his arm, her posture composed, eyes alert. This time the focus wasn't on what had gone wrong, it was on what had been hidden. The analyst began by explaining the structure of the trust in practical terms. Assets weren't static. They moved, they grew, they shifted, based on timing, marital status, and beneficiary designation. The amendment signed 2 years earlier had altered projected distributions significantly enough to raise concerns once full disclosure was examined. Numbers appeared on the screen. Property values, investment growth over time, percentages that translated into amounts large enough to change the shape of someone's future. I watched my parents' faces as the figures were explained. Not shock, not surprise. Recognition. They had known. The analyst paused on one particular slide. "This property," he said, pointing to an address I recognized vaguely from childhood conversations, was transferred into the trust shortly after the amendment. My father shifted. "It was meant to simplify things," he said. "For whom?" the senior partner asked, her tone unchanged. The analyst continued. "The transfer had been legal, properly filed, but the timing mattered. The value of the property had increased sharply after redevelopment plans were approved, plans that had been in motion at the time of transfer, though not yet public. That appreciation," the analyst said, "was not reflected in the initial valuation." Silence settled over the room. I understood then why my absence from the wedding had been so important. If the process had moved forward smoothly, if acknowledgement had been assumed, the amended distributions would have taken effect quietly. The appreciation would have been absorbed without question. No review, no recalculation, no interruption. The senior partner turned to Daniel. "Were you aware of this discrepancy?" Daniel hesitated. Claire's hand tightened slightly on his arm. "I knew the property was included," he said. "I didn't know the valuation would change so quickly." "That's unlikely," the analyst said gently, "given your involvement in the redevelopment discussions." Claire spoke then, her voice calm, measured. "We didn't intend to mislead anyone," she said. "This was about efficiency, about protecting family assets." The senior partner nodded. "Intent doesn't negate impact," she said, "and efficiency doesn't excuse omission." I hadn't said a word. That was what unsettled them most, I think. Not my presence, but my restraint. I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to accuse. I was there because the facts required me to be. The meeting shifted toward resolution. Options were laid out. Revaluation, redistribution, full disclosure moving forward. safeguards to prevent unilateral amendments without acknowledgement. None of it was punitive. None of it was dramatic. It was corrective. Daniel's jaw tightened as timelines were discussed. Delays meant adjustments. Adjustments meant uncertainty. Uncertainty was something he had never had to sit with for long. My mother finally spoke. "We never meant to shut you out," she said, looking at me for the first time that day. "We just thought you wouldn't be affected." I met her eyes. "I was always affected," I said quietly. "I just wasn't informed." The difference mattered. By the end of the meeting, decisions had been documented. Follow-up actions assigned. The trust amendment would be revised to reflect accurate valuations. Any future changes would require direct acknowledgement from all beneficiaries, no exceptions. As people gathered their things, the room felt different, lighter in a way. Not because everyone was satisfied, but because the truth had finally been placed where it belonged, out in the open. Claire approached me as the others stepped outside. Up close, she looked less composed, still controlled but tired around the eyes. "I hope you know this wasn't personal," she said. I considered her words carefully. "It was strategic," I replied. "And strategy always affects people." She nodded, as if she understood more than she wanted to admit. Outside, my father walked beside me, toward the elevators. "You could have made this much harder," he said. "I didn't want to," I replied. He stopped walking. "Then why does it feel like everything changed?" I thought about that for a moment. Because I said it was built on the assumption that I wouldn't notice. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I watched my reflection in the mirrored surface as it descended. I looked the same. Same posture, same quiet expression, but inside something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, my role in the family wasn't defined by what I was willing to endure. It was defined by what I was entitled to know. And as uncomfortable as that was for them, it felt like clarity to me. I didn't know yet how this would end, whether relationships would recover, whether distance would grow or shrink. But I knew one thing with certainty: whatever happened next would no longer happen without me. The public part came sooner than I expected. I had assumed everything important would remain contained within conference rooms and email threads, controlled environments where language was measured and outcomes were negotiated quietly. That had always been how my family operated. Discretion over honesty. Appearances over explanation. But once numbers changed, once delays affected other people's schedules and commitments, privacy became impossible to maintain. The first ripple showed up in an email forwarded to me by the law office. It was brief, procedural, and addressed to a wider audience than before. External stakeholders had been notified of a temporary adjustment in asset timelines. Nothing scandalous, nothing accusatory, just enough information to require explanation. That explanation apparently was expected to happen in person. The meeting was scheduled at a downtown conference center, neutral territory. Not a law office, not a family home. A space designed for transparency, with glass walls and long tables, meant to hold more people than comfort required. When I arrived, the room was already half full. There were representatives from the firm, a financial auditor, 2 advisors I didn't recognize, and seated near the front, my parents, Daniel and Claire. This time there were no name placards. No pretense that this was intimate or internal. As people took their seats, I became acutely aware of how visible everything felt. Conversations hushed when I walked in. A few curious glances. No hostility, just awareness. The kind that comes when something carefully managed begins to attract attention. The senior partner opened the meeting with a summary. Calm, efficient. She outlined the reason for the review, the findings so far, and the steps being taken to ensure compliance and accuracy. No names were singled out. No blame was assigned. But the facts spoke loudly enough. Charts appeared on the screen again, this time simplified, designed for a broader audience. Revised valuations, adjusted projections, clear explanations of why previous assumptions were no longer valid. When the topic of the wedding came up, it was framed not as a family event but as a triggering condition. A date. A legal milestone. One of the advisors asked a direct question. Were all beneficiaries informed prior to the event? The room went quiet. The senior partner answered. No. She didn't elaborate. Daniel shifted in his chair. Claire's posture stiffened. My parents stared straight ahead. That single word did more than any accusation could have. It introduced a crack in the narrative my family had relied on, the idea that everything had been handled responsibly, fairly, with everyone's best interests in mind. Questions followed. Not aggressive, just thorough. Why had acknowledgement not been obtained? Why had valuations not been updated in advance? Why had timelines been assumed rather than confirmed? Each answer circled back to the same place. Assumptions, convenience, silence mistaken for consent. At one point, an auditor asked if the uninformed beneficiary wished to speak. All eyes turned to me. For a moment, I considered declining. I had nothing to add, really. Everything important was already documented, spoken by professionals, recorded in minutes that would outlive any emotional reaction I might have. But then I stood. I don't have much to say, I began, my voice steady, because this was never about how I felt. I paused, letting that settle. It was about what I didn't know, and what I wasn't allowed to know. I didn't look at my family as I spoke. I looked at the room, at the people who were here because information mattered to them. I wasn't invited to the wedding, I continued. I wasn't told the date. I wasn't given the opportunity to acknowledge anything because I wasn't informed that there was anything to acknowledge. A few people nodded, not in sympathy, understanding. I'm not here to take anything from anyone, I said. I'm here because the process requires accuracy, and accuracy requires visibility. I sat down. No applause, no reaction, just a quiet shift in the room like something had clicked into place. The meeting moved on. Decisions were outlined, revised timelines approved, safeguards implemented. Everything was methodical, unemotional, but I could feel the weight of what had just happened settling over my family. This wasn't something they could minimize in private later. Too many people had heard the explanation. Too many records now reflected the reality they had tried to manage quietly. After the meeting ended, people filtered out in small groups, business cards exchanged, polite farewells. The room emptied slowly. My parents stayed seated. I gathered my things and approached them, not to confront, not to comfort, just to acknowledge that we were in the same space after everything. My mother looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "Did you have to say that?" she asked softly. "Yes," I replied. Because it was true. Daniel stood pacing a few steps away, his hands clenched at his sides. "You made us look careless," he said. "I didn't," I answered. "The process did." Claire didn't speak. She watched me with a look I couldn't quite name, calculation mixed with something like respect. Outside, the air felt different, heavier but clearer, the kind of atmosphere that follows a storm that didn't destroy anything but rearranged the landscape enough that you could never pretend it hadn't passed through. That evening, messages started appearing not from my family but from extended relatives. Vague questions, careful wording, curiosity wrapped in concern. Word was spreading, not as gossip, as information. I didn't respond to most of them. For the first time, I understood something important. Being quiet didn't mean being invisible, and being visible didn't require shouting. The truth had done its work without my intervention. It had stepped into rooms I wasn't invited to and introduced itself, and now everyone was adjusting to its presence. By the time the reason was finally spoken out loud, it didn't arrive as a confession or an emotional breakdown. It came the way most truths do, when they can no longer hide calmly, precisely in front of people who were no longer willing to accept half answers. The meeting that forced it wasn't labeled as anything dramatic. No emergency, no confrontation, just a scheduled follow-up requested by the firm with attendance marked as mandatory for all relevant parties. That alone said enough. We gathered again in the same conference center, but this time the tone had shifted. There was no small talk, no polite attempts to soften the edges. Everyone sat straighter, more alert, like they understood that this was the moment where explanations would no longer suffice. The senior partner didn't waste time. "We've reviewed the timeline in full," she said, looking around the table. "There is now a clear pattern, and before we proceed further, that pattern needs to be addressed directly." She turned to Daniel. "Why was your sister excluded from the wedding?" The question landed without judgment, without emotion. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced at my parents, then at Claire. No one moved to help him. "It wasn't exclusion," he said finally. "It was logistical." The senior partner didn't react. "Explain." He took a breath. "The trust amendment was written to take effect once I was married. We knew there would be questions if everything wasn't handled cleanly. We didn't want delays. Delays caused by what she asked. By review," he said. "By scrutiny." There it was. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He continued faster now, like once the dam had cracked, it was easier to let the rest spill out. He spoke about timelines, about how the redevelopment plans were already in motion, about how valuations would shift once approvals went public. He talked about pressure from advisors, from expectations, from the belief that everything needed to move quickly to avoid complications. "And where did your sister fit into that plan?" the senior partner asked. Daniel swallowed. She didn't. Silence followed. Thick, uncomfortable silence. Claire reached for his hand but didn't speak. My mother's face had gone pale. My father stared at the table. "So, you excluded her," the senior partner said, summarizing without accusation to avoid triggering review that would delay implementation of an amendment that materially benefited you. Daniel didn't deny it. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's what happened." No shouting followed. No raised voices. The room didn't erupt, because the truth didn't need dramatics. It was devastating enough on its own. The senior partner nodded once. "Thank you for your honesty," she said. "Now we can proceed." She outlined the consequences. Not punishment, correction. The amendment would not only remain under suspension, it would be restructured. Valuations would be recalculated based on accurate data at the time of execution, not projected convenience. Any future amendments would require not just acknowledgement but documented discussion. In other words, the shortcut had cost them the advantage they were trying to preserve. Throughout it all, I said nothing. I watched Daniel's shoulders slump as the implications settled in. I watched my parents absorb the realization that their attempt to protect one child had exposed their treatment of the other. I watched Claire sit very still, her expression controlled but tight around the edges. When the meeting ended, no one rushed to leave. Daniel stood and turned to me, his voice low. "I didn't think you'd ever find out," he said. "I didn't either," I replied. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. "You could have confronted us," he said. "You could have made this a fight." "I didn't need to," I said. "The facts did it for me." He looked away. Outside, my parents approached me together. My mother's voice trembled slightly. "We thought we were avoiding conflict," she said. "We didn't realize we were creating something worse." I didn't argue. "You didn't think I mattered enough to include," I said calmly. That was the conflict. They had no response. Later that evening, alone again, I replayed the meeting in my mind. Not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, just with a quiet sense of finality. The reason I hadn't been invited wasn't complicated. It wasn't about family dynamics. It wasn't about distance. It wasn't about oversight. It was about control. And control, once exposed, has a way of collapsing under its own weight. I had spent most of my life believing that endurance was noble, that staying quiet was a form of strength, that if I didn't ask for anything, I couldn't be disappointed. What I learned instead was this: silence doesn't protect you from being used. It only makes it easier. The truth had come out the next day, just as I'd been told it would. Not because someone confessed out of guilt, but because systems designed for fairness don't tolerate omission forever. And for the first time, I understood that justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as a question that can no longer be avoided. Once the reason was spoken, everything moved faster. Not emotionally, no one suddenly became expressive or remorseful, but procedurally. The kind of momentum that comes when authority steps in and decides that uncertainty has gone on long enough. 2 days after the final meeting, I received a formal notice from the firm. It was brief, direct, and written in language that left no room for interpretation. A judicial review had been requested to finalize corrective measures related to the trust. A judge would oversee the resolution to ensure compliance, transparency, and enforceability. The hearing would be public, not televised, not dramatic, but open on record in a courthouse where decisions became permanent. I read the notice twice, then set my phone down and stared out the window of my apartment. Cars moved below, people walked their dogs, ordinary life continuing without pause. It struck me how little the world cared about what my family was going through, and how much that fact steadied me. This wasn't personal anymore. It was institutional. The courthouse was older than the glass buildings we'd met in before. Stone steps worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. High ceilings that carried sound upward, making even quiet voices feel significant. We sat in rows separated by a center aisle. My parents together, Daniel and Claire a few seats away. I sat alone. No one spoke to me. The judge entered without ceremony. A middle-aged woman with a composed expression and a voice that commanded attention without raising volume. She reviewed the summary provided by the firm, asked clarifying questions, and confirmed the scope of the review. "This matter concerns fiduciary responsibility," she said, "not family sentiment." That distinction mattered. Documents were presented, timelines reconstructed, valuations compared before and after the wedding date. The judge listened occasionally, interrupting to ask about intent, knowledge, and disclosure. When Daniel's role was examined, he answered carefully, choosing words like someone who finally understood that improvisation had consequences. "Yes," he acknowledged. "I was aware that my marriage would trigger review." "Yes," he admitted. "I understood that informing my sister beforehand would complicate the process." "And you proceeded without informing her," the judge concluded. "Yes." There was no outrage in her response, no visible reaction at all. "Then the corrective measures are appropriate," she said. The ruling was concise. The amended trust would be partially invalidated where omissions had materially affected outcomes. Asset valuations would be recalculated using accurate data available at the time of execution. Future amendments would require documented acknowledgement from all beneficiaries witnessed and filed. The judge looked at my parents. "This is not punishment," she said. "It is restoration of balance." Balance. The word echoed quietly in the room. As the hearing concluded, I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief exactly, but release. Like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been set down. Outside the courthouse, the steps filled with people exiting other proceedings. Divorces, property disputes, small claims, everyone carrying their own version of consequence. My family stood a short distance away, unsure whether to approach. Eventually, my father did. "You didn't say anything," he observed. "I didn't need to," I replied. My mother looked at me, then really looked. Not with expectation, not with relief, with something closer to recognition. "We thought keeping you out would make things easier," she said. "For whom?" I asked gently. She didn't answer. Daniel remained silent. The confidence he'd worn for years, effortless, unquestioned, had dulled, not broken, just altered. Claire stood beside him, composed as ever, but no longer scanning the room like she was managing a narrative. There was nothing left to manage. As we parted ways, no one suggested dinner. No one proposed talking things through. The absence of forced reconciliation felt like another form of honesty. That night alone in my apartment again, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and thought about the word intervention. I had always imagined intervention as something loud, confrontational, a last resort when emotions ran out of control. But what I had witnessed was different. Authority didn't intervene to defend me. It intervened to correct imbalance. I hadn't won anything. I hadn't taken anything away. What I had gained was recognition, not emotional but structural, written into documents that wouldn't forget me when conversations grew inconvenient. For the first time, my place wasn't dependent on how little I asked for. It was guaranteed. And that realization settled over me with a calm I had never known before. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, uneven waves, quiet conversations, delayed messages, subtle shifts in tone that revealed more than words ever could. In the days after the hearing, my phone stayed mostly silent, not because no one had anything to say, but because everyone seemed unsure of how to say it. The structure that had protected certain assumptions for years was gone, and without it, people had to decide who they were to me without a script. My parents called first, not together, separately. My father's call came late in the evening after dinner when the day had run out of distractions. His voice sounded older than it had at the courthouse, less certain. "I keep thinking about when you were a kid," he said. "How you never asked for much." I waited. "We thought that meant you didn't need us," he continued. "I see now that it meant something else." "What did it mean?" I asked. He hesitated. "That you learned not to expect fairness." The word landed between us without accusation. "I don't want to argue," he added quickly. "I just wanted you to know I understand that now." Understanding didn't fix anything, but it did something quieter. It stopped the denial. My mother called the next morning. Her tone was softer, but there was an edge beneath it, like someone navigating unfamiliar ground. "I don't know how to repair this," she said. "I'm not asking you to," I replied. She was quiet for a long moment. "That hurts," she said finally. "I know," I answered. It did then too. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. For the first time, she simply listened. Daniel didn't call. Instead, he sent a message a few days later. It was short, carefully worded. "I didn't think it would go this far. I was wrong." I read it twice. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the years that had led to this moment. But there was something else, a crack in certainty, and that mattered more than a rehearsed expression of regret. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't withholding forgiveness, I was choosing clarity. Over the following weeks, practical changes followed the legal ones. Revised documents arrived by email. Clear summaries. Transparent language. My name appeared where it should have always been, not as an afterthought, but as a matter of record. Seeing it there didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me feel settled. Family gatherings became rare. When they did happen, they were smaller, quieter. No one assumed my availability or my silence anymore. Questions were asked where there had once been certainty. It was uncomfortable for them. For me, it was oddly peaceful. I noticed something else changing too, not just within my family, but within myself. I no longer felt the reflexive urge to smooth over awkwardness. I didn't rush to reassure people when tension appeared. I let pauses exist without filling them. Those pauses did important work. They forced honesty. They revealed intentions. They showed who was willing to meet me where I stood, and who preferred the version of me who stayed quiet. Some relationships softened, others thinned. Both outcomes felt appropriate. One afternoon, weeks later, I ran into Claire unexpectedly at a cafe near my parents' house. She looked surprised to see me, then composed herself quickly. "Can we talk?" she asked. We sat at a small table by the window. She spoke first. "I misjudged you," she said. "I thought you wouldn't care." "I cared," I replied. "I just didn't argue." She nodded slowly. "I see that now." She didn't apologize. But she didn't minimize either. "I'm adjusting," she admitted. "This isn't how I expected things to start." "Neither did I said. When we parted, there was no warmth, but there was respect. And sometimes that's enough. What surprised me most was how little anger I felt. I had imagined this moment being proven right, being acknowledged as something that would bring a surge of emotion, vindication, release, satisfaction. Instead, it brought stillness. The need to be seen had been replaced by the freedom to stand without explanation. I thought often about the version of myself who would have accepted exclusion as fate, who would have blamed distance, timing, inconvenience, anything but intention. That version of me had believed endurance was strength. I didn't judge her. She had done what she needed to survive. But I no longer needed her. The truth had done its work. Not loudly, not cruelly, just thoroughly. And in its wake there was space to define myself without contrast, without comparison, without the quiet pressure to be, less so others could be more. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to my family's expectations. I was responding to my own. The last change didn't come from a courtroom or a conference room. It arrived quietly the way most permanent things do, without announcement, without witnesses, without the need to be validated by anyone else. It happened the day I realized I no longer felt the urge to explain myself. Weeks had passed since the hearing. The revised documents were finalized. The emails slowed, then stopped. The machinery of correction had done what it was built to do, and like all systems, it moved on to the next task. Life returned to its normal shape. I went back to work fully. I took meetings. I met deadlines. I cooked dinners in my small kitchen and fell asleep to familiar silence. Nothing about my routine looked different from the outside. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. When my mother called now, she asked before assuming. When my father spoke, he paused before concluding. When Daniel reached out rarely cautiously, he no longer spoke as if my agreement was guaranteed. The hierarchy had changed, not because I demanded it to, because it could no longer exist unquestioned. At the next family gathering I attended months later, I noticed how different the room felt. Smaller, less performative. No one dominated the conversation. No one rushed to fill gaps. There were pauses, real ones, and no one panicked when they appeared. I sat on the edge of the group, not because I was excluded, but because I chose to observe. I watched how my parents interacted with Daniel, now more careful, less indulgent. I watched how Daniel spoke to me, measured, aware. I watched how Claire listened instead of steering. And I realized something important. Justice hadn't just corrected a document. It had recalibrated relationships. Not into something warmer, not into something closer, but into something more honest. That night as I drove back to my hotel, I didn't replay conversations in my head the way I used to. I didn't search for hidden meanings or missed opportunities to speak. I felt complete. The version of me who had once equated silence with safety would have mistaken this calm for emptiness. But it wasn't empty. It was grounded. I thought about the wedding again, not with bitterness but with clarity. I hadn't been invited because my presence would have slowed something down, would have forced truth to surface sooner, would have made people uncomfortable. And that was okay. Not because it was right, but because it showed me exactly how valuable my presence actually was. I didn't need to be loud to matter. I didn't need to fight to be included. I just needed to exist where decisions were being made. Standing tall, I realized, doesn't always mean standing at the center. Sometimes it means standing firm without apology, without explanation, without shrinking. The person I had become through this process wasn't harder. She wasn't colder. She wasn't more demanding. She was clearer. Clear about boundaries. Clear about truth. Clear about her worth. And clarity, I had learned, is something no one can take from you once you claim it. As I packed my bag the next morning, preparing to return to my own life, I felt no urge to linger. No need to check whether things were resolved. They were. Not because everyone was satisfied, but because nothing was being hidden anymore. That was enough. If there was a lesson in all of this, it wasn't about money or documents or even family loyalty. It was simpler and harder. When you make yourself small to keep the peace, you teach people how to overlook you. When you stop disappearing, the truth adjusts around you. Not everyone will like that adjustment, but the right things will survive it. And as I stepped back into my life, my quiet apartment, my steady work, my unremarkable routines, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not victory, dignity. There's a quiet lesson hidden in stories like this one that doesn't shout, doesn't demand applause, but stays with you long after the details fade. Sometimes, the deepest injustice doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from assumption, from people deciding what you can tolerate because you've always tolerated so much before. When you're the one who stays calm, who doesn't complain, who understands others, slowly begin to believe that your presence is optional, your voice unnecessary, your feelings manageable. But silence is not consent. Endurance is not permission. And being strong does not mean being invisible. What changed everything in this story wasn't confrontation or revenge. It was truth meeting structure, facts meeting accountability. A person who chose not to disappear anymore, not by shouting, but by simply standing where they belonged. Real justice often arrives quietly. It doesn't humiliate, it doesn't destroy, it restores balance. And sometimes the most powerful moment in your life is when you stop explaining why you deserve to be included and let the truth speak on your behalf. If this story resonated with you, take a moment and reflect. Have you ever been the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace? Have you ever been overlooked because people assumed you'd be fine? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you believe in stories where quiet strength wins, where dignity matters, and where truth eventually stands tall, consider subscribing to the channel. You belong here.